I've heard it said that life never really turns out the way you plan. I always thought that was a comforting platitude for people who'd had a string of bad luck. A way to reconcile dreams with reality. But standing there, fresh from burying my mother-in-law, I was about to understand that phrase in a way I'd never imagined. John was quiet after the funeral. Almost too quiet. It was unlike him. For a man who always had something to say, a man who could fill the silence between us with either a witty comment or a long sigh, it was unnerving. But maybe that was grief. After all, we'd spent years watching his mother's health decline. And as much as she and I hadn't always seen eye to eye, I'd tried to support him through it. But that night, after the service and the condolences, when I finally felt ready to take a breath and maybe even mourn with him, he took my hand. It was a gesture that once would have felt tender, intimate, only it didn't. His hand was limp, almost dismissive, and his face held no trace of the man I thought I knew. I remember the way he wouldn't meet my eyes when he said it. As though the truth itself was something shameful, he could only whisper to the floor, "This is my wife, and these are my kids." I waited, blinking, processing those words. His wife, we were married, and who were these kids he was talking about? But he didn't wait for an answer. I think he knew that no answer I could give would make sense. There was nothing for me to understand, nothing I could say that would repair the years he'd been living with someone else, leaving me with the scraps. There's no way to prepare yourself for a moment like that. It hits you all at once, and then it keeps hitting you. Each wave a fresh slap of betrayal until you're gasping for air. But that first wave, that first understanding that your life is nothing like you thought it was, that's the one that changes you forever. I left the funeral that day without a husband, without a family, and without any clear understanding of who I'd been to him for all these years. But I wasn't about to leave without finding out who I could be to myself. I didn't stay long after that. People were still milling around the cemetery, sharing memories of John's mother, some laughing, others crying, everyone touching shoulders and offering quiet condolences. And I, standing at the edge of that grave, was about to mourn a life very different from hers, one that had just ended without ever truly existing. The drive home was a blur. The scenery passed me by in a haze of colors and shapes. Meaningless and indistinct, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep my grip on the steering wheel. I had no words left, only questions that swirled around in a dizzying circle in my mind. Who was she? When did it start? How did I never see it? I opened the door to our house. No. My house. I corrected myself. I no longer knew what to call it. I'd moved into this space with him, made a life with him here, but now it all felt like someone else's story. The pictures on the walls, the furniture we'd picked together, even the laundry basket I'd filled countless times with his clothes, all of it now felt wrong. Foreign, like I'd walked into a stranger's life by mistake. I wandered from room to room in a daze, looking for some sign, some clue that might make sense of what he told me. But there was nothing. There were no signs, no hidden lives tucked into corners or memories that I'd missed. I'd lived here, we'd lived here, I'd thought this was our life. But it had all been a shadow of something real, a faint outline of a story he'd never let me fully read. I reached for my phone to call someone, maybe a friend or family member. But I hesitated. What could I even say? "Hi, just checking in. Oh, by the way, my husband has another wife and kids. I'm not sure who I am to him anymore." It sounded absurd even in my head, and I knew that saying it out loud would make it too real. Too raw, something I wasn't yet ready to confront. No, I wasn't ready to hear sympathy or anger or the sound of people stumbling over their own disbelief. Instead, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the empty room. Just days ago, I would have looked at this space with pride, a bedroom we'd made comfortable together. But now, in the silence, I realized I didn't know who I'd been sharing it with all this time. I fell asleep that night with his words echoing in my mind, their weight pressing down on me like stones. "This is my wife, and these are my kids." As if he'd rehearsed it. As if he were telling me that my role had ended, that my part in his life was no longer necessary. I drifted off with the slow, crushing realization that I'd become a stranger to the man I loved. And in doing so, I'd become a stranger to myself. The next morning, I woke up to an unbearable quiet. I'd always thought of mornings as sacred, in a way, an unspoken truce between night and day, where everything was softened. But that morning, the quiet was something else entirely. Something oppressive. It was the silence of an unraveling life, of walls that had once held everything I loved now standing hollow and still. I went through the motions of my routine, almost like I was on autopilot. Coffee brewed in the kitchen, filling the air with the scent of familiarity. But even that was bitter in my mouth. Each sip a reminder of the mornings we'd spent together. I'd make coffee, he'd tease me about needing it to function. I'd laugh and roll my eyes, as if it were our little ritual. It all felt so far away now, a distant memory blurred by a lens I hadn't known I was looking through. But the mundane tasks, brushing my teeth, washing my face, feeding the cat, gave me something to hold on to. Each small, mindless action brought a flicker of normalcy, a reminder that the world outside hadn't changed even if my own had been turned upside down. I spent most of that day in a daze, moving from room to room as if hoping to stumble upon something that would make sense of it all. At one point, I found myself standing in front of his closet, staring at the neatly arranged rows of shirts, pants, and shoes. Each piece seemed carefully curated, the sign of a life meticulously managed. How many times had I folded those shirts, hung those pants, polished those shoes, and all the while, he'd been keeping another life hidden from me. I pulled open drawers, rummaged through shelves, as though I'd find some hidden clue, some small token that would tell me who this other wife was. How he'd divided himself between us. Why he'd let me believe in a life that had never really been mine. But there was nothing. I wanted to scream, to tear his things from the shelves, to smash something just for the sake of feeling something real, something honest, something mine. But all I managed was a single tear, and then another, and before I knew it, I was sitting on the floor, my head in my hands, crying for a life I would never get back. When I'd finally gathered myself, I knew there was no avoiding the next steps. I called a lawyer, the words bitter on my tongue. I need to know my rights, I said, barely able to keep my voice steady. I imagined the person on the other end nodding, sympathy in her eyes even if her voice was all professionalism. She scheduled me for an appointment the next day, and for the first time since John's revelation, I felt a glimmer of purpose. The hours crept by after that, every tick of the clock reminding me of the life that had been taken from me. I couldn't escape the memories. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him at the funeral, that familiar face twisted into something cold and unfamiliar, delivering a truth that had shattered the foundations of my world. The following morning, I made my way to the attorney's office, hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel. This wasn't a step I'd ever imagined taking, but it was a necessary one. As I waited in the lobby, I felt a strange numbness settle over me, like I was watching someone else's life unfold. The lawyer, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a firm handshake, ushered me into her office and listened as I explained the situation. I could barely get the words out without feeling a surge of anger and humiliation. But she took notes, her expression serious and attentive. Legally, you have grounds for a divorce with significant settlement, she explained. Her words were a balm and a sting. Practical but impersonal. She didn't know the depth of my betrayal, didn't understand the years I'd poured into this marriage, the love I'd built my life around. To her, it was just another case. A story of infidelity and deception that would soon be filed away in a cabinet and forgotten. But to me, it was my life. I left her office with a thick packet of forms, each one representing another step toward the end of a life I'd believed in. As I drove back home, the weight of it settled over me, pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider what my life would look like without him. It was a daunting thought, one that filled me with fear and an ache so deep it felt like it would swallow me whole. But beneath that fear was something else, a spark of something that felt suspiciously like hope. Because as much as I hated to admit it, the life I'd been living with John had never really been mine. And maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to start over, to build a life that belonged to me and no one else. When I returned home from the attorney's office, I dropped the packet of divorce papers onto the kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time. It felt like a symbolic weight, a burden I'd have to carry alone now. Each page representing another piece of a life I was preparing to leave behind. I knew filling out the paperwork would be one of the hardest things I'd ever done. But I also knew it was the first step toward reclaiming myself. I wasn't just letting go of John, I was letting go of the version of me that had existed only in relation to him. To distract myself, I decided to take stock of the house. Cleaning was something I could control, a small thing I could accomplish. I tackled every corner, scrubbing away reminders of him, each swipe of the cloth like an erasure of his presence from my life. In our bedroom, I packed away his clothes, his cologne, his books, anything that had been his alone. I left only my things behind, as if I were marking my territory in a place that had never fully been mine. As the hours passed, I felt something unexpected, a sense of relief. The more I cleaned, the more I felt like I was making space for myself. There were moments when I'd pause, a pang of sadness piercing the numbness. But I kept going, determined to reclaim what I could of my world. By the time I was finished, the house looked different. My touch was everywhere, replacing his presence with something that felt a little more like me. Even if I didn't yet know who I was outside of him. The next few days were harder than I'd expected. I felt like I was in mourning, not just for my marriage but for the life I'd thought we were building together. Every moment was a reminder of what I'd lost, and though I tried to focus on the future, the past still clung to me, heavy and unyielding. I spent hours scrolling through photos on my phone, looking at pictures of us together smiling, laughing, standing arm in arm as if we were invincible. Each photo was a reminder of the illusion I'd been living, a portrait of a life that had never truly belonged to me. Part of me wanted to delete them all, to erase him from my memories entirely, but another part of me couldn't bring myself to do it. They were, after all, still my memories, even if they'd been built on lies. As I stared at the photos, I began to realize something unsettling. I'd spent so much of my life with John that I'd lost sight of who I was without him. I couldn't remember the last time I'd done something just for myself. Something that wasn't for his benefit or our shared life. I'd shaped myself to fit his world, and now that he was gone, I felt hollow, unsure of where to begin. But if I was ever going to move on, I knew I had to find out who I was on my own terms. I made a silent vow to myself that I would try little by little to reclaim the parts of me that I'd buried for the sake of my marriage. Just as I was beginning to find a tentative rhythm to my days, a new challenge presented itself. I was running errands at a store across town, picking up essentials and trying to hold on to the fragments of my routine. When I spotted him, John was on the other side of the aisle, standing with his other family, the woman he called his wife and the children he'd hidden from me for all those years. They were laughing, and he looked happy, as if his betrayal hadn't cost him a second of peace. I froze, my heart pounding as anger and sadness fought for dominance inside me. I wanted to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen him, but I couldn't tear my gaze from the scene in front of me. They looked like a picture-perfect family. The woman he was with, his real wife, was holding one of the children, laughing as he whispered something in her ear. I felt a pang of jealousy, not because I wanted him back, but because they looked like they belonged together. It was the life I thought we'd had, the one I'd believed in so completely. I turned to leave, but he saw me. For a brief moment, our eyes met, and I saw a flicker of something in his gaze, guilt, maybe, or perhaps just surprise, but he quickly looked away, pretending as if he hadn't seen me, as if I were just another stranger passing by. I walked out of the store, fighting back tears, the weight of his indifference pressing down on me. That encounter was the wake-up call I needed, a reminder that he'd moved on without a backward glance. I knew then that if I was ever going to find peace, I'd have to do the same. The days that followed were filled with small victories and moments of quiet introspection. I started taking walks around the neighborhood, allowing myself the time to think, to reflect on everything that had happened. I discovered new routes, parks I'd never visited, and for the first time in years, I began to appreciate the beauty of my own company. I also reached out to friends, people I hadn't spoken to in far too long. They were understanding, supportive, offering words of comfort that helped ease the ache in my heart. We laughed together, shared stories, and little by little, I felt pieces of myself coming back to life. One of my friends, Rachel, invited me to a pottery class, and though I was hesitant at first, I agreed. Sitting at the wheel, shaping clay into something tangible, something real, felt oddly therapeutic. Each piece I created was a small reminder of my ability to create, to build something beautiful from nothing. It wasn't just the pottery. I started trying other new things too, cooking recipes I'd always wanted to try, visiting museums, even spending afternoons at the library, picking up books on topics I'd never explored before. I was rebuilding myself, piece by piece, filling the empty spaces he'd left behind with things that were mine alone. Months passed, and with each passing day, the hurt began to fade. It wasn't a quick or easy process, but slowly, I began to feel lighter, more grounded. I'd created a life for myself that felt real, a life that wasn't defined by someone else's choices. Then one evening, as I was walking through the park, I saw him again. He was with his family, pushing one of his children on a swing. They looked happy, and for the first time, I didn't feel the familiar pang of sadness or resentment. Instead, I felt a quiet acceptance, a sense of peace I hadn't thought possible. Seeing him didn't hurt anymore. I didn't need to confront him, didn't need answers or closure. I'd already given that to myself. I turned and walked away, a smile on my face, knowing that I was finally free. In the months that followed, I found a new apartment, a cozy space that was all mine. I filled it with things I loved: plants, books, art, and made it a haven of peace and comfort. My life wasn't perfect, but it was mine, and that was enough. I began to look toward the future with hope. I wasn't sure what lay ahead, but I knew I was ready to face it. I'd built a foundation for myself, one that no one could take away, and that strength became my anchor, my guiding light. Sometimes, when I think about the life I left behind, there's a lingering sadness, a quiet ache for the dreams I once had. But that pain no longer defines me. I am stronger now, resilient in a way I never thought possible. As I look back on my journey, I realize that John's betrayal, painful as it was, became a catalyst for my growth. It taught me the importance of self-love, of resilience, of building a life that belongs to me alone. And though I'll carry those memories with me, they're no longer weights pulling me down. Instead, they're stepping stones on the path I've carved for myself. A reminder of how far I've come. For the first time in my life, I am truly free to love, to live, to dream, and to be myself without compromise. And that, I realize now, is the greatest gift I could have ever given myself.